Hello, and thank you so much for joining me once again. Today we are doing the skirt and the bow pieces from Danny Choo's schoolgirl uniform pattern. And these are a little bit more complicated to me, I think. They're not something I'm as familiar with. I've literally never made a pleated skirt before this, so I do make at least one pretty notable mistake, but we'll cover that, and the bows end up turning out really cute. So without further ado, here we go.
Alright, so now we're going to do the skirt and the bow for the schoolgirl pattern. So the skirt pattern, he mentions, I don't remember where I read it, it was probably in Instagram or something, but you're supposed to, oh not that one, you're supposed to line up your stars. And that does include, he includes the overlap on both sides. I am 99% certain. So, one of the best ways to do that is to hold it up to light. And I'll try to see if I can get it to show up on camera. I have my doubts. Anyway, it's much oh yeah, you can kind of see it. Much easier to see in person, but that is how you line it up. And one thing when you do that, yes, you want the star to look correct, but you also want to line up these two top lines and these two bottom lines as well. And you do that twice. You do that with the black star and with the white star. And like I said, much easier to see in person. Don't fret too much about it. Another thing I've noticed with this pattern, I'm pretty sure it's auto, like the PDF files are the A4 or whatever the international, like everybody but the US uses, because it makes more sense. But I am stuck with US printer and US letter paper, which cuts it off on both ends. And I did a lot of voodoo in Photoshop and managed to print one side and the other side. And just to compare them for you, if you just let this print at 100% like normal, the difference is not huge. So you'll just add about 1/4 inch of just a straight line on this side. That's nice and easy, and that's honestly, you wouldn't even necessarily need to do that because you've already got your star, and as we just talked about, it overlaps. So this one you can just ignore, just understand that you don't have quite as much overlap on this side. This side is just the tiniest bit more complicated, but honestly not a big deal. So you do lose this line a bit, and that's fine. And then you lose most of your seam allowance. So if you just keep this going at its very, very gentle curve, just sketch that in. Let's see here. Yeah, so if you just sketched this in, kind of following that gentle curve, and then give yourself the seam allowance, it is exactly 8 millimeters, or in inches is something kind of weird. What is it? Somewhere between 5 and 6/8. Honestly, you're better off just using the millimeters. So, not too bad. You can just print this piece off, make sure you give yourself a little bit of seam allowance on that side, and you're good to go.
So I've cut my pieces, and you can see this tiny piece, you actually end up folding down the center and then folding the two sides in, and that just makes nice edges on both sides. The bigger pieces is a little bit different, and I'm trying to kind of figure that out as we go. We'll get more into that later. For the waistband pieces, the biggest trick is to make sure that you're making them mirror images of each other. You want one of the pieces is a little bit longer than the other one, and you want those to be able to, with right sides facing, match. So they're mirror images. Just keep that in mind when you're sewing them. Now, we sew that teeny tiny piece for the bow, and I'm just going like a millimeter from the edge and top stitching. It's definitely tricky. You want to go slow and just careful. For the bow piece, I think it's like 4 or 5 millimeters seam allowance, and I leave a space in the center. So I'm stitching, and then I pull my needle up, pull it forward, and then I start again. And there is a definite reason for that. Now we're just stitching the waistband pieces together so that it's done.
Okay, so the tailor's noodle made another appearance. Now, you can see we've got our little opening there, but it's pretty well hidden in the seam. What we're going to do next is center that seam. That's going to be our back, and we're just going to stitch this down on both sides. And then we'll use that little hole to turn it inside out, which should be a fun adventure, I'm thinking. I didn't want to iron these seams flat because I didn't want to iron them back the other way when we flip this inside out. If you don't have a tailor's noodle and you don't want to spend a day making one, you can just iron it flat. It's fine. It's not a big deal. This little guy turned out great. And these also look good. I like that you can't see the seams in this pattern at all, hardly. But the goal was to make sure that we had the long one and the short one match up when we put them right sides facing. And that is what happened. So if these don't line up, you probably got your pieces mixed up somewhere.
Now we're just stitching those edges flat like I talked about. And then I am going to sew the waistband pieces together using my normal trick of leaving about 1/4 of an inch unsewn near the edge and using that to fold over and make a nice edge on the inside later. Similar to the collar piece on the shirt pattern, if you want to go watch that as well. So now I am trimming my corner pieces because I need to flip that inside out. I'm also just trimming and snipping because that is a pretty steep curve and you'll want to snip your fabric along that edge to relieve the tension when you turn it right sides out. This is another part where it's very nice to have a good iron to just iron the snot out of it because there's no other way to get your fabric to really behave. And now we're gonna try to flip this inside, or not inside out, right side out. I couldn't do it with just my fingers, so I snagged a needle nose pliers. You do want to be careful with the needle nose pliers because it's pretty easy to damage fabric with them. But in this instance, I literally don't think I could have done this without it. It really helped pull that through, and I did leave my holes in the back a little small. So if you don't have access to a needle nose pliers, maybe leave those a little bit bigger and you could probably poke it through with a pencil or something. Now we're playing around with the bow, and this part definitely takes a lot of fiddling and just carefully trying to hold it and play with it and make it look as nice as possible. I do hold it in place with a sewing pin, And that really helped make the hand stitching process so much easier because that pin held all those different layers in place. I don't know how to do this without hand sewing, so that's all I did. I just stitched that back piece, and after I tucked the raw edges underneath. And I did make a few stitches that went through all the pieces, including the bow and the ribbon, because it just made it a little bit sturdier, a little bit less likely to fall to pieces. You might notice that my ribbon is not even, and it kind of sucks, but I should have been paying more attention. It's not a big deal though, the snap doesn't sit at the very center of her neck and back, it just sits a little off to the side in the end, so I didn't want to re-hand sew everything, so I just left it. And here you can see me doing kind of big, gentle stitches. You don't need to pull them super, super tight. They just need to be there to hold everything in place. I also, to get those two pieces to pull down, I did tack that with a quick hand stitch as well. And that just holds the bottom pieces of the bow together and makes them look a little bit more like in all of the pictures I've seen. And I do think that was something mentioned in the Japanese instructions. It looked like there was a picture of it, but again, I couldn't read it, so I don't know for sure. It ended up, I like that look a lot. And then we try it on the doll to make sure that size and everything else is right, and it looks correct. This is where I was finding out that my one piece was shorter than the other one, and deciding that I didn't care enough to go back and fix it. I did hand stitch the little snaps on, but it was boring to watch, so I cut it. It's pretty straightforward. You've seen me hand stitch snaps. Now we are marking all of those pleats, and I did notice that in the pattern the pleats are slightly curved, and I tried to do my best to maintain that. As you can see, I'm kind of using a pin to show. This took a really long time to mark out, and I was just very, very lucky that I happened to be using fabric that my chalk pencil, it's a watercolor chalk pencil so that it'll wash out, was actually working on it, because it doesn't always work on every fabric. This was definitely probably my least favorite part about this whole project, because it just took forever, and I was so worried about keeping those delicate curves in place, and honestly, in the end result, I don't know if it was worth it. I might have just done straight lines and been fine with it. I also go through and hem the bottom before I get too much further with the pleats, because I didn't want to accidentally rub all the pleats off while I was hemming. So I took a break to go hem that real quick, and you will notice that the hem seems like it's awfully thick. I suspect that is to add a little bit of weight to the bottom of the skirt, because with these, super short skirts, having the weight to hold them down in the proper shape is a little tricky. So I just left all that fabric there to kind of weigh that down. And I didn't want to keep folding it over because I was concerned that it would make the pleats lay a little funny. And I'm pretty happy with that decision. I think that was a good plan. As you can see, I am pinning all of those little pleats, and now we're gonna stitch every single one of them. And as I was doing this, I eventually realized that it was much better to not cut my thread between pleats and then just gently pull the thread out, move the fabric over to the next pleat, and go again. This saved me so much thread and also time, because I wasn't spending all that time cutting the thread and than having 800 million pieces of thread free floating. This was much more predictable and a little bit easier to clean up when I did have to finally cut the thread. You can see it's a habit. Sometimes I messed up and did it anyway, but no, I highly recommend just don't cut your thread, just gently pull as much ease as you need out of the machine and keep on going. So at this point you're going to want to iron your pleats down, and the easiest way I found to do it was to just pin each pleat in place facing in the direction that it needed to go, which easiest way to describe that is the direction that had the room for it. One side didn't really have room for the pleat to lay and be fully covered, and the other side did, so that's where I put my first pleat and I let it mark the direction for all of the rest of them, and I just pinned each and every one of them and then attacked them mercilessly with the iron to kind of keep them in place as much as possible while we work on the next part. This is actually where I make my mistake. I decided to top stitch the pleats in place first, and what I ended up doing was catching some of the back pleats, and it made it harder to reinforce the back side of the pleat like the instructions implied with their little stitch lines. So don't do it in this order, do it in the other order. And if you're wondering what I mean by reinforcing the back of the pleats, that's what I'm doing here. So literally I'm just stitching a millimeter away from the edge on each of the back of the pleats, and this is an absolutely brilliant way to keep them from softening up, because you can iron something until the end of time and that crisp edge is eventually going to wear off. Well, it won't if you stitch it down. So that's kind of why that step is in place. Now I needed to attach the skirt to the band, and I realized that the band had marked on the pattern every single pleat, and that's amazing. That's actually extremely useful, and what I'm doing here is lining up my actual skirt with the waistband so that I can mark each and every one of those pleats, and then I'm going to pin them all down in their spot, and that just helps keep everything even all the way around the waistband, and it's extremely useful and I highly recommend it. Alright, so now we're gonna very slowly sew that down, taking our pins out as we go and making sure that none of the material bubbles up. It is a little bit trickier because the waistband is so curved, so you do want to be a little careful with that. Now I cut out the extra seam allowance in the waistband because it was so bulky it was getting in the way of turning it over. And you can see I'm kind of thinking about if I want to turn the edge on the inside of the waistband or not. It's something I tend to decide based on how likely it is that area is going to be seen versus how difficult it is to do. If it's easy to do, I do it. But in this case, it was fairly difficult and I decided against it because it's not going to be seen really. So after a lot of pinning I did off camera, apparently, you can kind of see I got everything laying flat, and here I'm just showing you want to fold that edge over. We're going to top stitch it down, and then we're also going to stitch just like it's only like half an inch of the back seam together as well. when I stitched this, I did actually stitch right in the seam as opposed to top stitching because that flap was hanging so far over the edge, I didn't need to worry about not catching it. And now I am stitching that little 1/2 inch at the back of the skirt, and then I'm going to top stitch the bit that overlaps. Yep, there you can see me top stitching that down. Since it was about clear as mud how the back of the skirt worked out, I decided to show you as a bit of an afterthought. And you can see the skirt here. It is supposed to lay as flat as possible, and I think it's okay. It's not perfect. In the back here, you can see I stitched the back seam up until the fabric, on the pattern piece, there was that little bit of fabric that stuck out farther than the rest. That's kind of what I used to fold over and top stitch to make a clean edge for that. And I did the top stitching after I did the seam so that I could specifically force that edge, essentially. And what I don't like about it is that it buckles a little bit. I think it would be pretty easy to fix that by just adding a small snap in the very center, and it would be barely noticeable. The other thing I don't care for is that raw edge is just gonna be a raw edge, the one that's under the finished edge, and I haven't figured out a way to make that not be an issue without adding bulk. And because this is doll clothing, of course, we just kind of make those sacrifices in the name of keeping things not bulky, because in the end it tends to look better. So that's kind of the finished edge. I hope that was a little bit more illuminating than just watching me push it through the machine. So now we're done. It was a bit of a process, those pleated skirts. My goodness, that's a lot of work. But the end result looks amazing, of course, and these patterns are just so detailed, and yeah, just so much detail, which I deeply, deeply appreciate. The shirt I love. I think the shirt specifically has the potential to be so many things. It's so versatile. I think making long sleeves and short sleeves and stuff like that is going to be super easy edits, which I'm looking forward to. Gosh, yeah, that was a fun project, and I really hope that this video kind of helps to demystify it just a little bit. If you like stuff like this, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe, and I hope to be doing more in the future. You have a great day.